Hi guys and girls, I'm Obsidian Ant and welcome back to Elite Dangerous. In this video I will be talking about what fleet carriers will and won't bring to the game. So in essence, there's going to be some decent happy things to talk about, there's going to be some things that really aren't so good at all, and a whole bunch of things that are somewhere in the middle. Anyway, over on Reddit there's a thread gathering feedback on carriers, putting a set of questions for players. The idea is that this can be passed on to Frontier, and if you want to get involved with that, do check out the link in the video description. Now, here's the good parts about fleet carriers, the things that I feel will actually add to the game. Of course, it's important to understand that fleet carriers are aimed at only a smaller segment of the player base. Carriers are endgame content after all, designed with players who have significant sums of cash and even playtime. My recent poll suggests that this might be between 4% to 8% of the current player base, with another 10% or so being within range of that. It's not really the ideal situation for many players, as everyone is so keen for something new to get involved with. But up to this point, Elite hasn't had endgame content, and maybe Frontier feel that this is the answer. Whether that's right or wrong though, only time will tell. Anyway, onto those features. So carriers will act as a mobile player-owned space station. It will allow you to keep all of your assets in a single location and provide a portable service station with nearly all of the functionality you require. In short, it will reduce pointless travelling from A to B in order to cash in vouchers or to refuel and restock. This then is a huge and a great benefit. Carriers will likely be great for squadrons and player groups. They will almost certainly come up with both inventive ways to use them with the BGS, and even though carriers will not be directly linked to the BGS, they will likely nonetheless bring a lot to the table for that type of gameplay. Carriers will likely open up the possibility of creating a player-owned bubble all across the galaxy, various different ones that is, with the ability to deliver services, ships, modules and all of that within the local areas. It's likely we will see a number of smaller player-owned bubbles coming into existence in this manner. However, some of this will be limited by the lack of true player economy. That is, while stations can generate a small profit, they cannot create or manufacture anything. Carriers will also be good for business opportunities, such as placing near mining rings and buying up all of the ore mined by players, but this will have some issues as it will create a race to the bottom, and more on that in just a bit. Carriers will also be good for bringing services to systems that don't have any, for example shipyards out in the Pleiades, but this will be limited by a lack of stock, not to mention the fact that carriers probably need to travel back and forth in order to resupply. Also, carriers are going to be great for reaching previously unreachable areas. After all, there's a whole bunch of locations that have never been visited before, simply because they are too far away, and with 500 light years on the jump range of a carrier, it's going to be very easy to reach them. Also, the player inventory on carriers is absolutely awesome. It's something that players have wanted for a very, very long time, so it's about time to see that, and yeah, I'm very pleased with that. Carriers are also going to be good for setting up home in your chosen location anywhere in the galaxy, whether that's inside or outside the bubble. Also, in theory at least, carriers would be good for transporting players to other locations, such as Colonia, but of course this is going to be significantly limited by the amount of time that it takes to get there. And one other thing that I really do like that we've seen so far is the ability to remote manage carriers, so you can be anywhere in the location, anywhere in the galaxy rather, and summon the fleet carrier to your location, or indeed send it to another location. A very nice touch. So some of those features are pretty much game-changing. The mobile base is one of those, as is the potential for players to create their own bubbles. Also, the player-to-player trading could be a big thing, really depending on how profitable that turns out, and I'm sure there's going to be many, many more. Let's move on to the things that I feel are fairly neutral. Again, upkeep aside here, keeping that as a separate subject, and damn, that upkeep issue really does touch on everything, doesn't it? So, purchase price. A lot of people cannot afford a 5 billion credit carrier. A recent poll I ran, that's now had over 17,000 responses, suggests that 74% of players have less than 1 billion credits, and a further 17% of players have up to 4 billion credits, but don't actually have the required 5 billion. So this leaves just 8% of the community that can afford to buy a fleet carrier right out of the gate and right now. Out of that 8%, only 4% currently have 5 billion, the other 4% have in excess of 5 billion. Bottom line, only this 4% currently have the ability to fully purchase and then fully fund a carrier. Now, Frontier likely have more accurate stats than this, and we have to keep in mind that this is just a small sample of the overall player base, and that sample will have some bias. However, it's nonetheless a good indication of where things stand. It's also reasonable to assume that Frontier are aiming the carrier at less than 10% of the current player base, and that they also feel a sizable chunk of the player base, in addition to that, maybe as much as 15% based on these stats, would also be able to catch up. So basically 4% of players that can use them right now, with as much as 25% of players being willing to use them perhaps. Personally, I feel that 5 billion really is about right for endgame content, but, and this is a big but, I also feel there's a problem for players who don't have that kind of money and would likely never have it. For those, I feel Frontier should introduce a smaller carrier, similar in concept perhaps to the current outposts. Perhaps, for example, these small carriers, these outpost-styled carriers, would only have small and medium landing pads and no large ones, and perhaps they wouldn't have all these service features. But nonetheless, I think it would provide a middle ground for players that need something new, but can't or don't want to pay for the costs of a large fleet carrier. Now, another issue that I'm fairly neutral about is the upgrade costs. Upgrade costs, of course, are the costs used for installing additional services onto fleet carriers, and these currently, based on information that we've seen so far, are charged at 50 million credits per service. Now, if someone can afford a fleet carrier, they shouldn't really have too much of an issue in affording these additional services, so personally I don't see it as too much of an issue in that regards. The running costs for these services, however, the upkeep costs, are entirely another matter. So that kind of brings us on to the more problematic issues with what we've seen so far about fleet carriers. Again, we'd also save upkeep cost as a separate discussion here, simply because even if upkeep was removed entirely from the game, these issues here would still be very much a problem. So let's start. The first of these is, why would anyone buy modules, ships or commodities from a carrier if the price on the carrier is higher than from a regular station? And this one really is difficult to fathom. There are a few edge cases, of course, most of them involving convenience. For example, if a person with a carrier was to bring supplies out to an out-of-reach location that don't currently have them, the players might be willing to pay the premium for them, but for the most part, a journey into a space station to purchase a ship or module doesn't take that long. And if you're to find a station that offers a discount, that can bring significant savings. So why then would any player actually purchase a ship or even indeed a module from a fleet carrier, unless of course they are being sold for a cheap price there? But that really does bring up another question: why on earth would a carrier owner sell cheap in the first place? Lack of universal cartographics. Now this one is huge, it's massive, and it's a deal breaker for many. There's no getting away from it. Fleet carriers have an upkeep cost. When out in deep space, upkeep costs will not be funded via sales or via the service of goods. They will not be funded by selling mined ore. The only way to maintain the upkeep costs is for an exploration carrier is to directly fund it out of your own wallet. Just basically put 1 billion credits straight into the bank. Some feel that this isn't a significant issue, simply because you can just dump 1 billion credits into the carrier's bank and then run it for a year without any problems. But for many, carriers represent an opening for additional ways to play the game, similar to those I mentioned near the start of the video. A mobile base of operations for exploration is indeed a fantastic idea. However, fleet carriers do not have universal cartographics, and this means that you cannot sell exploration data to a carrier. Consider for a moment that carriers have services that purchase bounty vouchers, codex data, and indeed many other things besides. The lack of cartographics then makes no sense in this context. One theory, of course, is that the lack of this service maintains the integrity of exploration, meaning that players need to return to the bubble to sell data. However, the bottom line here is that this really does undermine carriers as an option for exploration. As a compromise here, perhaps the storage of data on carriers until they return back to the bubble could be an option. Another problem related to exploration is the slow jump times. 1 hour to charge the drive and another hour to cool down. In short, it takes 2 hours to make a 500 light year jump. This means it will take around 88 hours to get to Colonia and 261 hours to get to Beagle Point. And those are direct times without any stop-in and literally playing non-stop, also without stopping to refuel. There's certainly an argument to be made that fleet carriers shouldn't be faster than regular ships simply for gameplay purposes. However, this is still a real problem for explorers. 8 hours to travel 2,000 light years really isn't ideal. Mining 500 tons of tritium when out in the black will be a problem for many lone explorers. And again, this is another issue for explorers. After all, who would have thought that with me being primarily exploration focused? So mining 500 tons of anything really does take some time, and with each jump requiring around 500 tons of tritium, which is used for fuel, explorers could find themselves doing a lot of mining indeed. Now, the other option here, of course, is that tritium can be purchased from stations with refinery economies. It's perfectly possible for players to stock their ship up with 26,000 tons of the stuff before leaving. That is 1,000 tons in the fuel tank and another 25,000 tons in the player inventory. However, that's likely to be expensive, and it would also eat into storage space. The point here, though, is that even if a player decides to use just half their inventory space and takes maybe 10,000 tons of tritium with them, they will then be able to make 20 jumps covering around 10,000 light years. But even after that, they would be back in the same position of requiring more fuel. That's fine if they're at the destination they want to get to, but if they want to carry on exploring, it's likely to be an issue. This, of course, is fine for players operating in or near the bubble. This jump range is perfectly fine. However, it's a significant issue for exploration. The player market will be a race to the bottom. Now, this is something I touched on briefly earlier. Whilst there's likely a number of very imaginative ways to use carriers to generate a profit, the chances are that whatever idea you come up with, whatever concept you decide on to use your carrier to create a profit, it's very likely that when someone else finds out what's going on, they will simply park their own carrier right next door to you and offer the service at a same price. And at this point, any service will basically then become a race to the lowest possible price. As the game doesn't have a true economy, that is to say, as commodities are not used for manufacturing, then all we have is a player market, and it really is inevitable in that situation that it all becomes a race to the bottom, to the lowest price. For squadrons, there is a lack of shared access to the bank. Only a single commander can fund the upkeep, and this may be a problem for squadrons and larger groups. So basically, it means that each carrier has to be maintained by a single player. So with that issues out of the way, with all those issues out of the way, let's move on to upkeep costs. And I do appreciate this video's going on a fair long while now, much longer than most of my videos, but there's a lot to cover here. Carriers are pretty significant after all. So upkeep costs. It's one of the big issues. Fleet carriers have upkeep costs. Currently these have been shown to be a base of 10 million credits per week. But do keep in mind that these figures are only from the development build images that Frontier have showed, so it's perfectly possible and indeed quite likely that these numbers will change. They could go up, they could go down, we'll have to see. But for now, these are the only images, these are the only data that we actually have. So regarding upkeep, there's basically 4 schools of thought about this. The first is that upkeep is fine. There's a number of reasons people accept upkeep. Primarily among these is because fleet carriers generate passive income. A few people also feel it is fine because of realism. And of course, there's a few other reasons that people support fleet carriers upkeep. The second reason here, the second school of thought, is that upkeep is fine if it isn't too expensive. The third school of thought, upkeep is bad as a concept. It's bad simply because it punishes people who do not play. 4. Upkeep is bad because it's too expensive. All of those are valid opinions in my book. Personally, I'm with option 3, that upkeep is bad as a concept. It's negative reinforcement, pure and simple. I don't think anyone really could argue against that as a concept. Whether or not you agree with it is another matter. It's also a mechanic that very few games outside of free-to-play games or survival games actually use. But it seems to me at least that the primary drive here is one to push players to keep playing, with the threat that if you don't, you will lose your carrier. There are a few alternative thoughts among the community here though. One is that upkeep is there purely not as a punishing factor, but because fleet carriers do generate that passive income as we mentioned earlier. And this line of thought reasons that Upkeep is needed to put a balance check on that. But there's a very easy alternative here. Simply put a tax on the profits that a carrier makes and place that tax on an upward curve. So basically, the less a person plays, the more profits are taxed. It's not ideal, but it prevents people from leaving the game for months at a time and then coming back to hundreds of millions of credits in profit. It also avoids the negative reinforcement of leaving the game for months at a time only to return to a massive upkeep bill or even a lost fleet carrier. On another note here, if we run with the current available figures, we can see that a basic carrier would cost around 500 million credits or so a year to run. A fully outfitted carrier, meanwhile, would cost up to potentially 1 billion credits, and that would include the fully fitted additional services, all of them, the wear and tear on jumps, as well as fuel purchases. It's a significant amount of money, but for players who these carriers are aimed at, that 4%, that 8%, it is a sum that's easily achievable. But at the end of the day though, for me at least, it's not really the cost of the upkeep that is a problem, but rather the principle that is being used here. I'm not a fan of negative reinforcement in games. Also, it is a problem for players who are in the other percentage of the game, the players that really want something new but can't afford this endgame content. Again, maybe that suggestion of these smaller carriers. For me then, it might sound like over half of this video is criticism against carriers, and that is a fair point because it's true. But also, I feel that carriers are a good move for Elite. They have the potential to shake the game up and bring in something new. Also, they serve as a focus for players with lots of credits who need something to do. Further, imaginative players will no doubt come up with creative ways of using carriers, and that really is something that's going to be very interesting to see. Ultimately then, a good chunk of all of this really does hinge on whether or not Frontier are able or willing to address some of the more glaring problems here. With at least 2 months to go until launch, they certainly have plenty of time to do exactly that. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.